Three military helicopters descended on Ravenwood Medical Center at 11:47 p.m. Rotors screaming, floodlights cutting white across the wet asphalt. Armed men in tactical gear hit the ground running before the landing skids even touched down. They blew through the emergency entrance with a gurney, a soldier bleeding through every dressing they'd packed, and one word that stopped the entire trauma bay cold. "Where's Beacon?" Every doctor, every nurse, every tech in that room turned and looked at each other. Nobody answered, and then, slowly, heads turned toward the corner, toward the woman in faded scrubs pushing a supply cart, head down, clipboard in hand. The woman nobody had ever really looked at. If this story already has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The supply cart had a squeaky left wheel. Lena Whitmore had been meaning to report it for 6 weeks. She never did, because reporting things meant conversations, and conversations meant attention, and attention was the one thing she had spent 2 years carefully, deliberately avoiding. Ravenwood Medical Center was a Level 2 trauma facility in Callaway, a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest where it rained 8 months out of the year and the hospital parking lot flooded every February without fail. It wasn't a prestigious posting. The permanent staff made that clear in small ways. The way they didn't save a seat in the break room, the way they talked over float nurses during handoff briefings, the way charge nurse Clara Odom would glance at Lena's badge at the start of every shift as if she might have forgotten who she was. Float staff. Temporary. Fill in. That's what the badge said, more or less. Ravenwood used float nurses to cover gaps in scheduling, and Lena had been filling gaps for 2 years. She'd floated through the surgical floor, the ICU, the step-down unit, the pediatric ward. She knew every supply closet, every broken call button, every monitor that beeped 3 seconds late. She knew this hospital better than most of the people who thought they owned it. She knew it, and she let them believe otherwise. Tuesday had started like every other Tuesday. Lena clocked in at 7, pulled her assignment, restocking Trauma Bay 2 and covering the East Corridor until the overnight float arrived, and got to work without announcing herself. She ate lunch alone in the stairwell because the break room was loud and she preferred quiet. She charted accurately and efficiently and handed off to the next nurse without incident. By 10 o'clock, she was pushing the supply cart down the hallway toward the storage room, making a mental list of what needed to be reordered when the overhead PA fired. Trauma activation, Bay 1, ETA, approximately 8 minutes. Multiple casualties inbound. She kept walking. Trauma activations weren't her assignment. She'd been pulled into them before, handed gloves and told to hold retractors or push meds, but tonight she wasn't on the trauma rotation. She had a cart to finish. She was turning the corner toward storage when she heard the helicopters. Not 1. 3. The sound was wrong for a civilian medevac. Too heavy, too coordinated, the rotor pattern overlapping in a way that meant military transport, not air ambulance. Lena stopped walking. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the cart and listened, and something in her chest did what it always did when she heard that sound. It remembered. She pushed the cart against the wall and walked toward the emergency entrance. The sliding doors were already jammed open by the time she reached them. 2 hospital security guards stood to the side looking uncertain, which was their default expression whenever something exceeded their training. Outside, across the ambulance bay, 3 Blackhawk variants had set down in the open lot. 1 on the helipad, 2 on the wet asphalt where the staff parking spaces were, and men were moving fast between them. Military. Full kit, minus the weapons, most of them. One group carried a gurney. Another formed a perimeter that wasn't technically necessary inside a hospital parking lot, but was clearly habitual. A figure broke from the group and came through the doors first. Tall. Rigid posture that didn't entirely come from training. Some of it was pain, or exhaustion, or both. He was maybe 35, wearing tactical clothing that had seen better days, a rank patch she clocked without meaning to. Captain. Special Operations. "Trauma Bay," he said to the security guard. "Now, where?" The guard pointed. The man didn't thank him. Lena stepped back. She was already against the wall, already in the background, already invisible the way she'd practiced. The gurney came through the doors next, and she got one look at the man on it. She looked longer than she meant to. The dressings on his chest were military-grade hemostatic gauze, the kind hospitals didn't stock, the kind you carried in a combat kit. There was blood at his collar, and his left arm was immobilized with a field splint that someone had improvised from what looked like tent stakes wrapped in paracord. His color was wrong, not just pale, gray in a specific way that she recognized. Tension, not confirmed, not diagnosed, just a pattern she had seen before in conditions she was not supposed to have experience with. She followed them in. Nobody noticed. The trauma bay at Ravenwood seated a team of 8 comfortably. Tonight it had 12 people crammed into it, plus the gurney, plus the captain, plus 2 of his soldiers who had posted themselves against the wall and were watching everything with the controlled stillness of people trained to assess threats. Dr. Nolan Pierce was the attending on call. He was a competent physician, thorough, methodical, trained at a solid program. And those qualities were working against him right now because the situation in front of him did not reward methodical. He was reading the field notes the soldiers had brought, a handwritten assessment that someone had done in moving conditions and still managed to keep legible. "Pulse ox," he said. 89 and dropping, said the monitor tech. "Mechanism?" "Blast overpressure and fragmentation," the captain said from across the room. He hadn't introduced himself. He stood with his arms crossed, watching Pierce the way someone watches a surgeon about to cut into someone they love. "Left side. Impact approximately 2 hours ago. He was stable until 40 minutes out. We'll need imaging." "He doesn't have time for imaging," the captain said. Pierce looked up. "Sir, I need to follow protocol. Your protocol is going to kill him." The room went tight. The nurses kept working, but everyone was listening. Clara Odom, charge nurse, 43 years in the hospital system and proud of every one of them, stepped forward from near the doorway. "Captain, I understand you're concerned, but Dr. Pierce is our attending physician, and this is his... Does anyone in this room have combat trauma experience?" Silence. The captain looked around the room. His eyes moved the way trained eyes moved, systematically, assessing each face. He got to the doorways. He stopped. Lena hadn't meant to be visible. She'd come through the doorway intending to pull supplies from the cabinet on the east wall, which she needed regardless of what was happening in this bay, and she'd gotten as far as the cabinet handle when his eyes found her. He stared. Not the way people usually stared at her. Through her, past her, cataloging her badge and assigning her a category and moving on. He stared the way someone stares when they're looking for something they didn't expect to find. "What's your name?" he said. Clara turned. "She's float staff. She's here to restock." "I asked her." Lena's hand was still on the cabinet handle. She could feel the room shift, that specific shift that happened when attention she'd worked to avoid landed on her anyway. She'd felt it before, in other rooms, in other contexts that had nothing to do with hospital supply cabinets. "Whitmore," she said. The captain's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "First name?" "Lena." He studied her for another 2 seconds. Then he looked away and back at the patient, and Lena did not know what to make of that. She pulled the supplies she needed and stepped back toward the wall. Bombed. Pierce was working. He was good at the mechanics. Airway secured, 2 large-bore IVs running, fluid going in. But he was working through a framework that assumed certain things about the patient in front of him, and one of those assumptions was creating a problem that nobody in the room had caught yet. Lena caught it. She stood at the edge of the bay with a tray of unused supplies and watched the monitor and watched the patient and did the math that she'd done in worse conditions than this, without the benefit of a monitor or a tray or a room with climate control. The fluid was wrong. The rate was wrong for this presentation. And the way Pierce had positioned the patient, flat, textbook trauma positioning, was working against the pressure differential she could see building in the man's respiratory pattern. She took 1 step forward, then stopped. Not my call. Not my room. Not my role. The pulse ox dropped 2 more points. Marcus, she'd heard them use his name twice. Marcus shifted on the gurney, a small, involuntary movement that meant he was responding to something his body understood before his consciousness did. "He's fighting the vent," the respiratory tech said. Adjust the settings, as Pierce started. It's not the vent, Lena said. The room didn't exactly stop, but it paused in that particular way, where everyone pretends they didn't hear something and waits to see if it will be said again. Clara turned fully around. Her expression was the specific expression of someone who has decided they're about to correct a mistake. Ms. Whitmore, the fluid rate is masking a developing tension presentation, Lena said. She said it flat, factual, the way she'd been trained to communicate under pressure. No hedging, no apology, no softening. He needs to come up about 30 degrees and someone needs to reassess the left chest. The field notes mention blast overpressure. That's not just fragmentation injury. Pierce looked at her. He didn't look dismissive, that wasn't his character, but he looked uncertain, which in this context amounted to the same problem. She's not on the trauma team, Clara said. To Pierce, not to Lena. She's float staff restocking the supply cabinet. I can see what she is, Pierce said, still looking at Lena. What's your basis? Respiratory rate and pattern suggest air trapping. The drop in pulse ox isn't responding to the oxygen because the problem isn't perfusion, it's pressure. The position you have him in is worsening it. She watched Pierce process it. She watched him do what doctors sometimes did, which was reverse engineer whether the information in front of him had enough credibility to act on, not based on whether it was correct, but based on who had said it. She's not qualified to make that assessment, Clara said. Ma'am. The captain had moved. He was 3 feet away from Clara, and he hadn't raised his voice, but the word had edges. My man is dying. I don't care about credentials right now. This is a hospital, not a battlefield. Then act like it, he said, and let the person who knows what she's seen do her job. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, the monitor alarmed. Ox dropping, the tech said. 84. Pierce made a decision. Lena could see it happen. The moment when training took over from hesitation. Reposition him, he said. 30 degrees. And get me a needle for chest assessment. Lena moved to the bedside. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't been formally given a role. She stepped into the space that had opened up at the left side of the bed, and she pulled on a pair of gloves and she began her own assessment with her hands, which told her things the monitor couldn't. Decreased breath sounds. Left side. Significant enough to be definitive. Tension pneumothorax, she said quietly. Not for the room. For Pierce, who was right beside her. He needs needle decompression, second intercostal midclavicular line. Pierce was already reaching for the kit. Clara stepped forward again, and there was something almost desperate in it now, the kind of desperation that comes from being the authority in a room where authority is being redistributed faster than you can manage. Dr. Pierce, I need to formally note that we have an unqualified staff member performing Clara. Pierce's voice was quiet and final in a way that ended the sentence for her. Get me more light. She stopped. For a moment she just stood there, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Then she stepped back and did what he'd asked. The needle went in. Marcus's oxygen came up almost immediately. The monitor shifted from alarming to merely elevated. The respiratory tech said, "He's fighting the vent less," and Pierce exhaled through his nose and began adjusting the parameters. Lena stepped back. She pulled off the gloves. She stood at the edge of the bed and watched the numbers stabilize and kept her face neutral, because that was what she did. That's what I would have done, Pierce said. Not to Clara, not to the room. To her. It sounded like an acknowledgement and also like a question. She didn't answer it. The captain was watching her. He'd been watching her since the moment she'd spoken, the kind of watching that meant he was putting something together, assembling pieces that he hadn't expected to find in this configuration. He took 2 steps toward her and stopped at the appropriate distance, and his voice dropped low enough that it didn't carry. Whitmore, he said. That's my name. Callsign Beacon, Combat Medic, 5th Special Forces Group, 3rd Operational Detachment. He paused. You went by Lena Caldwell then. She looked at him. Remarried, she said. Changed it back to my maiden name. He studied her face. You let them call you float staff. I am float staff. You saved this man's life. Dr. Pierce saved his life. The captain's jaw moved. You want me to pretend that's what happened? She didn't answer that either. She looked past him at Marcus, who was breathing with less effort now, the color in his face shifting from ash toward something closer to human. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, and she thought about other chests she had watched in other places with less equipment and worse odds and no one standing around to acknowledge what was happening. Is he going to be stable? She said. If you tell me yes, I'll believe you. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the IV lines, the rate, the position, the O2 delivery. She ran the calculation the way she always ran it. Not hopeful, not pessimistic, just accurate. He needs surgery for the fragmentation injuries, she said, but the immediate crisis is resolved. If they get him to the OR in the next 40 minutes, yes. Okay, the captain said. He said it like it was enough. Like her word, in this room where nobody had wanted to hear it, was sufficient. She picked up her supply tray. I need to finish my restock, she said. She turned and walked out of the bay, and for the first time in 2 years, inside the walls of Ravenwood Medical Center, the room she was leaving was completely quiet. Clara Odom found her 20 minutes later in the East Corridor supply closet. Lena heard the footsteps, precise, deliberate, the walk of someone who has organized their anger into something they intend to use, and kept counting IV bags. I need you to explain what happened in that bay. I gave an assessment, and Dr. Pierce made a clinical decision, Lena said. 14 bags of normal saline. We're low. You stepped into a trauma resuscitation without authorization. I made a verbal observation. Dr. Pierce had authorization. He acted on it. That's a very careful way to describe what you did. Lena set down the bag she was holding. She turned around and looked at Clara, and she let herself really look, because usually she kept that to minimum. Enough to understand, not enough to engage. Clara Odom was good at her job. That wasn't something Lena doubted. 2 years at Ravenwood had shown her a charge nurse who ran a tight floor, who advocated for her staff when it mattered, who knew every protocol and applied them consistently. She was also a woman who had decided what Lena was before she ever asked, and who had organized her entire understanding of the situation around that initial decision. The patient is stable, Lena said. That's the outcome. The process matters. It does. I agree with you. Clara seemed to have expected something else. The agreement landed wrong. There will be a review, she said. Patient advocacy will be involved. I need to document this correctly. Document it accurately and we'll agree, Lena said. I made a verbal clinical observation. I didn't touch the patient until Dr. Pierce authorized it. I performed a secondary assessment and relayed findings to the attending, who made all treatment decisions. Clara stared at her. You coached him through a needle decompression. I provided information. He's the physician. Where did you get that knowledge? The question sat in the air between them. Lena picked up the clipboard with the supply count. I've been in healthcare a long time, she said, as a float nurse. Among other things. Clara's eyes narrowed. She was smart enough to hear the gap in that answer, to understand that something was there that she wasn't being shown, but she didn't have the language for it. Or maybe she didn't trust her own read because she'd already decided what Lena was, and revising that was uncomfortable in ways she wasn't ready for. This isn't finished, Clara said. I know, Lena said. I'll cooperate with whatever review you initiate. I've got nothing to hide. Clara left. Lena listened to the footsteps until they faded, and then she turned back to the supply shelf and finished the count. 14 bags of normal saline. She wrote it down. Inand. She was changing out of her scrubs at 12:40 a.m. when the captain appeared in the hallway outside the locker room. She knew he was there before she saw him. The sound of his footfall was specific, a controlled cadence that didn't belong in a hospital corridor at this hour. She finished buttoning her jacket and pushed open the door. He was leaning against the opposite wall, not blocking her, just present in the way that certain people were present, occupying space with intention. Marcus is in surgery, he said. Good. They said 90 minutes, maybe less. She nodded. I need to ask you something, he said. You've already asked me things. Not this. He pushed off the wall. He wasn't in captain mode now. That thing had receded into somewhere behind his eyes, and what was in front was something more human and less controlled. Why here? Why Callaway? Why Ravenwood? Why Floatstaff? She thought about giving him the careful version. She had it ready. She had several versions ready, for several kinds of people asking several kinds of questions. She didn't use any of them. I was tired, she said. I wanted somewhere that didn't need anything from me. He was quiet. Did you find it? He said. She thought about the supply cart with the squeaky wheel, the stairwell where she ate lunch, the 6 years of combat rotations she had folded up and put somewhere behind her sternum and chosen not to open. She thought about the man on the gurney whose chest she had read like a language she still spoke fluently, even after everything. For a while, she said. The captain, Voss, she remembered now, the name on the field notes, Captain Ethan Voss, looked at her with something she couldn't categorize and didn't try to. I have to file a report, he said. About tonight. About what happened in that bay. Okay. Your name is going to be in it. She'd known that was coming. She'd known it from the moment she'd opened her mouth in the trauma bay, from the moment she'd stepped forward instead of staying against the wall. 2 years of careful, deliberate invisibility, and one dying man's respiratory rate had undone all of it in 40 minutes. I figured, she said. The report goes up the chain, above my chain. He paused. People are going to want to talk to you. People already want to talk to me, she said. The charge nurse just spent 5 minutes explaining how I'm going to be reviewed. Something moved across his face. The review is the least of your problems. She looked at him. What's the most of them? He seemed to be deciding how much to say. It was a familiar calculation. She'd watched people make it 100 times, in briefings and debriefs and conversations that happened in the margins of official ones. There's a reason my unit knew to look for Beacon, he said. There's a reason we came here specifically. She went still. Not outwardly. She didn't do things outwardly unless she chose to. But inside, something that had been dormant for 2 years shifted and oriented and paid a different kind of attention. We tracked down 3 people tonight, he said. You were the last one we found. Tracked down for what? He looked at her steadily. I'll know more after Marcus is out of surgery and I can make some calls. But I need to know. Are you willing to hear it? Lena stood in the hallway of Ravenwood Medical Center in her street clothes, her shift technically over, her supply cart parked and counted and documented, and she looked at Ethan Voss and she thought about tired. She thought about how tired was something she'd been reaching for and never quite finding. Ask me again after your report is filed, she said. She walked past him toward the exit. Behind her, she heard him say quietly, to no one in particular, or possibly to her, she's exactly who they said she was. She pushed through the door into the rain. The parking lot was still lit with the portable floodlights the military vehicles had brought. The helicopters were still there, 2 of them anyway. One had already lifted, carrying something or someone she didn't know about. She stood in the wet air and looked at the helicopters and thought about the sound they made, how the rotors cut a particular frequency she felt in her back teeth, how she had once found that sound horrifying and then necessary, and then, somewhere in the years between, almost like a strange kind of orientation, a sound that meant she knew exactly where she was and what she was supposed to do. Her car was parked in Section D. She had a 9 o'clock shift tomorrow. She had a squeaky wheel on a supply cart that needed to be reported. She started walking toward Section D. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it for one full breath before she answered. Whitmore. Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Not Voss, not anyone from tonight. We know you're at Ravenwood, the voice said. We also know what you did in that bay tonight, and we need you to understand something very clearly. A pause, deliberate and calibrated. Marcus Hale was not supposed to survive. The rain hit the asphalt around her feet. The helicopter's floodlights threw long shadows across the parking lot. Lena stood completely still. Who is this? She said. The line went dead. She stood in the rain with a dead phone line and the sound of rotors still cycling down behind her, and she did not move for a full 10 seconds. Not out of fear. Fear was something she'd learned to process the way other people processed weather. Acknowledge it, factor it in, keep moving. What held her still was something more specific than fear. It was the particular calculus of someone who had just understood that the situation they were standing in was several layers deeper than it had appeared 60 seconds ago. Marcus Hale was not supposed to survive. She looked at the phone. Unknown number. No callback, no trace, nothing useful. Whoever had made that call had made it from a device they didn't care about, which meant they had resources and they had planning and they had been watching tonight's events closely enough to know her name and her location within minutes of it all happening. That was not a small thing. She turned and walked back toward the hospital. Voss was still in this hallway outside surgical waiting when she found him. He had a paper cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking and his phone in his other hand, and the look of a man running parallel operations in his head while trying to appear like he was just waiting. "I got a call," she said. He looked up. Something in her face told him not to ask preliminary questions. "From who?" "Unknown. Male. He knew what happened in the Bay tonight, and he knew Marcus's full name." She paused. "He said Marcus wasn't supposed to survive." Voss put the coffee down on the nearest surface. The change in him was immediate and specific. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a shift in his entire orientation, like a compass needle finding north. "Say that again?" She repeated it word for word. She had the exact phrasing locked in, which was habit, more than anything she'd consciously chosen. Her brain recorded things in critical moments with a fidelity she'd sometimes found more burden than gift. Voss was quiet for a moment. "How long after I left you?" "Less than 2 minutes." He turned away from her and pressed his phone to his ear. She couldn't hear what he said, but she could hear the texture of it. Clipped, urgent, coded in the particular shorthand of someone talking to someone who already knows most of the context. He was on and off in 90 seconds. "I need you to stay in the building," he said. "I have a shift tomorrow." "Lena?" It was the first time he'd used just her first name, and the way he said it moved her name from one category to another. "Someone with access to tonight's operational details just threatened you by implication. That's not a thing I can let you walk into a parking lot alone after." She thought about the 2 men she'd noticed at the edge of the parking lot while she was standing there. She'd clocked them automatically, positioned, not moving, watching, and filed them as part of the military contingent, a perimeter detail. Standard. Now she wasn't sure they'd been his. "Who else knew Marcus was coming here tonight?" she said. "Officially, my commanding officer and the flight team. Unofficially," he stopped. "That's what I'm working on." She sat down in one of the hard plastic chairs lining the surgical waiting area. It was the kind of chair designed to be endurable rather than comfortable, which she found strangely appropriate. She looked at the linoleum floor and did what she did when she needed to think. She got very quiet and let the information arrange itself. 2 years at Ravenwood. Nobody knowing who she was. A life she had constructed specifically to be small and still and unremarkable. And she had been good at it, better than most people could manage, because she had learned in conditions that most people never encountered what it cost to be visible and what it cost to survive. She had made a choice in that trauma bay tonight. She hadn't been able to make any other choice. That was the honest version, the version she didn't usually say out loud, because Marcus Hale had been dying, and she had known exactly what was happening to him, and doing nothing had not been an option her body would accept. But there was a consequence to that choice, and it had started arriving before she even made it to the parking lot. "Tell me about Marcus," she said. Voss looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why was he in the field? What was the op? And why would someone not want him to come back from it?" He was quiet. "You're going to have to trust me enough to give me context," she said, "or I can't help you figure out where the leak is, and you have a leak. Someone with inside information made a call to my personal number." She paused. "How did they even have my number?" Voss sat down in the chair next to her. He sat the way he did everything, deliberately, like he was choosing the action rather than just doing it. He laced his hands together and looked at the floor. "Marcus was running surveillance on a supply chain diversion," he said. "Military-grade medical equipment, specifically drugs, controlled surgical agents that have a street value about 6 times their procurement cost. Someone inside the DoD supply network has been siphoning them for 14 months. And Marcus found out who. He found documentation 3 days ago. He was extracting with the files when the improvised device hit the vehicle. His voice was flat and factual, and she could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. We got him out. The files came with us. Where are the files now? On a secured drive, locked in the aircraft. She thought about the one helicopter that had already lifted. Which aircraft? Voss looked at her, and she could see the moment he made the same calculation she just had. He stood up and walked away with his phone already at his ear. Checked. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the skills that didn't get listed on any certification, but mattered more than most of the ones that did. She watched the surgical waiting area fill and empty with the ordinary traffic of a hospital in the middle of the night. A family cluster in the far corner, 3 people in the strain-specific silence of waiting for news they might not want. A man pacing near the vending machine. A child asleep across 2 chairs with a jacket over her. Normal. All of it brutally, specifically normal. Clara Odom appeared in the doorway at 1:30 a.m. Lena saw her before Clara saw her, and she had about 3 seconds to decide how to play this. She was still in street clothes, technically off shift, technically in a waiting area she had no clinical reason to be in. She stayed where she was and let Clara find her. I thought you'd left, Clara said. I'm waiting for an update on the patient from Bay 1. That's not your patient. I know. Clara stood there in the particular way she stood when she was deciding between several options and hadn't picked one yet. She was still in her charge nurse scrubs, which meant she'd either stayed late or come back in, and neither of those suggested she was done with tonight. Patient advocacy sent me a preliminary form to complete, Clara said. About the events in the Bay. Okay. I need your version of events in writing by end of your next shift. That's fine, Lena said. I'll write an accurate account. Clara's eyes did something then. A quick, involuntary narrowing that she probably didn't know she did. A tell that said she was recalibrating. She'd expected more friction. She'd prepared for more friction, and the lack of it was throwing her. You don't seem worried, Clara said. About what specifically? About what the review might find. Lena looked at her steadily. What do you think it'll find, Clara? The first name landed different than Clara had anticipated, not disrespectful, careful, the kind of deliberate that communicated awareness. I think it'll find that a float nurse overstepped her scope of practice in a high-stakes situation, Clara said, and her voice was more measured now, less certain than it had been in the supply closet. I think there will be questions about your background and your qualifications that you haven't been transparent about. Have I ever claimed qualifications I don't have? Lena said. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. Have I ever misrepresented my credentials? Lena said. Have I ever told anyone at Ravenwood that I wasn't a nurse, that I wasn't float staff, that I was something other than what my badge says? That's not the point. Then what is the point, Clara? Because if the point is that I did something tonight that helped a patient survive, I'm not going to apologize for that. And if the point is that I should have stayed in the supply closet while a man died, then I think the review is going to have a harder question to answer than what scope of practice I was working under. Clara's jaw tightened. She was a woman who had spent decades being right in this building, and being right had become structural for her. It was how she understood herself in her role. Tonight had introduced a variable she didn't have a category for, and what she was doing right now was trying to find the category that let her remain right. We'll see what the review says, Clara said. She left. Lena sat back. Lena, her shoulders ached. She hadn't noticed until now. The particular ache of a body that had been running on adrenaline and had used it all up. She rolled her neck and listened to it pop and thought about the bottle of ibuprofen in her locker. Voss came back 15 minutes later. His face told her something before his mouth did. The aircraft that lifted was the decoy, he said. Standard protocol, huh? Split the assets, confuse surveillance. The drive is secure. He paused. But someone followed it. We lost 2 of my people tracking the tail vehicle before they figured out it wasn't carrying anything. So they have people on the ground here? Yes. And they knew which aircraft was which means the leak isn't just access to tonight's operational details. She looked at him. The leak is inside your unit. He didn't answer right away. The not answering was its own answer. How many people were on tonight's operation? She said. 10, including Marcus. And how many knew the full route and destination before Wheels Up? 4. He sat down again, this time like his legs decided before he did. Me, Marcus, my XO, and the flight lead. 3 people who aren't Marcus. I've worked with all 3 of them for years. I know, she said. That's not an argument. He looked at her sideways and she recognized the expression, the particular face of someone being told something true that they'd been resisting knowing. She'd worn it herself once, years ago, in a different room when someone had told her that the casualty patterns she'd been seeing weren't random. You need to start thinking about who benefits from Marcus not coming home, she said. Not who would want it, who specifically benefits from the documentation he found never reaching anyone with authority to act on it. That's a long list. It always is, she said. Marcus came out of surgery at 2:47 a.m. The surgeon, a compact woman named Dr. Ferrante, who moved like she had somewhere more important to be even when she was standing still, came into the waiting area and gave Voss the report in the direct shorthand that surgical staff used when they'd been on their feet for 6 hours. Stable, fragments removed, 1 rib, some muscle damage, no organ involvement, lucky about the lung. The preliminary intervention, Ferrante said. Whoever did the chest decompression in the field, that bought him the time he needed. Without that, we would have been working on a much worse situation. It wasn't in the field, Voss said. It was in your trauma bay. Ferrante glanced at Lena. You. Dr. Pierce made the call, Lena said. Dr. Pierce told me what happened. Ferrante studied her in the way surgeons studied things, comprehensively, without self-consciousness about the looking. Nolan Pierce is a good physician. He also said he needed someone to tell him what he was seeing. Lena didn't respond. Whatever you are, Ferrante said, you should be working in trauma. She left without waiting for an answer. Voss was quiet for a moment. She's not wrong. She doesn't have the full picture. Neither do I, he said. That's what I've been thinking about for the last 2 hours. I have pieces of you. From the records, from what I know about Beacon, from tonight. But I don't have the thing that explains why you're here pushing a cart. She didn't owe him an explanation. She knew that, and she thought he probably knew it too, and neither of them said anything about it, which meant the explanation came out in the space that the unsaid things left. I did 4 tours, she said. The last one. She stopped. Restarted. The last one ended with an investigation. Not about me, about an officer in my unit who was making decisions with bad information, and people were dying because of it. I was the one who documented it. I filed the report. She paused. It went nowhere. The officer was reassigned, not disciplined. 2 of the people who died because of his calls had families who were told it was enemy action. Voss was very still. When I came home, I had the option to re-enlist, and I didn't take it, she said. I got my civilian nursing licensure, and I found the smallest, quietest place I could, and I took work that didn't ask me to be anything more than what I looked like. She looked at the floor. It wasn't a plan. It was just what I could manage. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when someone has said something that cost them something to say, and the other person understands that responding incorrectly would be worse than not responding at all. The officer, Voss said finally. From your last tour. What about him? Do you remember his name? She looked at him. Something in his tone had shifted. It wasn't idle curiosity. It wasn't context building. It was targeted. Why? She said. Because the supply chain diversion that Marcus was investigating, Voss said. The authorization signatures on the diverted procurement orders. He stopped. There's a name on them. Someone who was reassigned out of field command approximately 3 years ago and landed in a logistics oversight role. The waiting room hummed with its own low institutional frequency. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped in steady sequence. The child in the corner stirred and pulled the jacket tighter and didn't wake up. Lena was very careful with her breathing. What's the name on the documents? She said. I was hoping you'd tell me if it matches anything you know. Voss. Lieutenant Colonel Dale Morrow, he said. The name hit her somewhere physical. Not her chest, lower, a place she associated with the particular sensation of knowing something she'd been trying not to know for a long time. Dale Morrow, callsign Condor, 3rd rotation, Korengal sector. The officer who had sent a 4-person team into a compound based on intelligence he knew was 36 hours stale. 2 of those people hadn't come back. Lena had written the report. Lena had documented everything. Lena had handed the paperwork to the chain of command and watched it disappear like a stone into still water. Dale Morrow had been reassigned to logistics. Marcus Hale had found his name on diverted procurement documents. Marcus Hale had nearly died tonight. And someone had called Lena's personal number within 2 minutes of Marcus surviving to tell her that outcome was not what had been intended. She became aware that her hands were completely flat on her thighs, pressed down in the unconscious posture of someone preventing themselves from making fists. "He knows I'm here," she said. "Who?" "Morrow. He knows I'm at Ravenwood." That call wasn't just a threat about Marcus, it was a message to me specifically. He knows what I did in that bay tonight, and he knows my name, and he called my number, which means... She stopped. "Which means he's had eyes on me. Not just tonight. He's been watching me." Voss's jaw tightened. "How long?" "I don't know. Long enough." She thought about the months of careful smallness, the chosen invisibility, the scrubs and the supply cart and the stairwell lunches. All of it suddenly reframed. Not peace, but surveillance. Not escape, but a perimeter she hadn't known she was inside. "There's something else," Voss said. He looked like a man who didn't want to say the next thing. "Say it." "Morrow's name is on the documents Marcus found, but there's a cosigner, a secondary authorization on 3 of the largest diversions." He paused. "The cosigner's ID traces to someone inside Ravenwood." The air in the room felt different than it had a moment ago. "Inside the hospital," she said. "A procurement account. Medical supply ordering. We've only had the documents for 72 hours and the forensic trace is still being built, but the preliminary read, who?" He looked at her steadily. "We don't have a name yet. We have an account ID. But if someone inside this hospital has been co-signing diverted DOD medical supply orders with Morrow, then they knew Marcus was coming here tonight. They may have known before we did." Lena sat with that for a moment. She let it fully arrive because that was the only way to deal with information like this. Let it land, let it become real, then decide what to do with it. Someone inside Ravenwood. She thought about the years she'd spent here, the people she'd watched, cataloged, understood in the way that people who stayed invisible understood others, from a remove, carefully, without attachment. The faces that came to mind weren't accusations. They were data. And somewhere in that data was a person who had helped route military medical supplies for profit and had known a wounded soldier was inbound tonight and had done nothing to prevent what almost happened, or had done something to ensure it would. "The supply cabinet," she said. "Bay 1. Voss frowned. "What about it?" "I restocked it earlier tonight before the activation. Standard restock. IV bags, suture kits, medication trays." She looked at him. "When Marcus came in, one of the medication trays was wrong. I noticed it when I pulled the sedation kit. The concentration was off. I caught it before anything was administered. I assumed it was a labeling error, and I pulled the correct tray." "A labeling error?" "That's what I assumed." But if someone inside the hospital knew Marcus was coming and knew the trauma bay assignments for the night, a wrong concentration in the sedation kit is a very easy thing to arrange. And in a high-pressure trauma resuscitation, if someone had used what was in that tray before I caught it... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Voss stood up fast enough that the plastic chair scraped back. He had his phone out before he was fully upright. "That tray," he said. "Where is it?" "I pulled it and set it on the secondary cart. It should still be in Bay 1 unless the evening clean crew already..." "Don't move," he said, and he was already walking. Lena sat in the waiting room of Ravenwood Medical Center at 3:11 in the morning with the sound of Voss's footsteps fading down the hallway, and she put together the shape of what she was inside. Not an accident. None of it was an accident. Marcus targeted, the route leaked, the aircraft surveilled, her number known. And somewhere in this building she had chosen for its smallness, its unremarkability, its distance from everything she'd been trying to leave behind, somewhere in this building was a person who had signed their name next to Dale Morrow's on documents that had cost people their lives. She thought about the supply cart. the squeaky wheel. She thought about how 2 years of invisibility could look like safety and still be something else entirely underneath. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. Unknown number again, different from the first one. She could tell by the last 3 digits that appeared on the preview before she opened it. She opened it. 4 words and an image. The image loaded slowly on the hospital's Wi-Fi, and she watched it resolve pixel by pixel into something that made the breath she'd been taking stop halfway. It was a photo of her locker. Open. Someone had been in her locker, and on the shelf where she kept her personal items, where she had stored 2 years ago and never moved, a small zippered case that held certain documents she'd never submitted but had never thrown away. The documentation from her report, the names, the dates, the chain of evidence she had compiled about Dale Morrow, and the deaths he had caused and the accountability he had never faced, that case was gone. The 4 words in the text read, "We have it all." She stared at the text until the screen dimmed. 4 words, a photograph. Her locker, open, the shelf cleared of the one thing she had carried from her previous life and never put down. The documentation was gone. She stood up. Not fast. Fast was visible. Fast was panic, and panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford in conditions that mattered. She stood up the way she stood up from supply counts and medication checks, which was to say, she stood up like someone who had a next task and was simply moving to it. She walked to the nursing locker room. The locker was exactly as the photo had shown it. The lock was intact. Whoever had done this had a key or a master, which eliminated opportunistic and landed squarely on deliberate. Her scrubs were still folded on the hook, her water bottle, her granola bar, the ibuprofen she'd been thinking about. All present. The zippered case was gone. She stood there with the locker open and did an inventory of what she'd lost. The physical documents, the originals she'd kept, the copies she'd made before she filed the report, the timeline she'd constructed, the names and dates and location coordinates she'd written by hand in a field notebook that she'd transferred to a civilian journal when she mustered out. The chain of evidence reconstructed from memory because memory was the one storage method she'd trusted completely after everything else had proven fallible. Gone. What was not gone? Her memory. Every name, every date, every coordinate, every signature. 2 years of sitting in stairwells with very little to occupy her mind had meant she'd run through those details the way other people ran through music playlists. Not obsessively, just habitually, keeping the information current in a way that meant she would never need to look it up. Morrow had the documents. He didn't have what was inside her head. That was something. She closed the locker, went back to the hallway, and called Voss. He answered on the first ring, which told her he hadn't put the phone down since he left. "The medication tray," he said before she could speak. "It's been logged as a labeling discrepancy in the pharmacy system. Someone entered a correction record at 11:42 tonight, 40 minutes before the trauma activation." She absorbed that. Someone created a paper trail making it look like a routine correction. Before Marcus even arrived, which means they knew the timeline. "Voss, my locker was accessed. The documents I had from my investigation into Morrow. They're gone." Silence for 2 seconds. "You had documentation on Morrow. For my last tour, I filed the report and it went nowhere. I kept copies." She paused. "They took the physical copies. I have everything memorized." She could hear him processing. "How long ago was your locker opened?" The photo timestamp says 11:58, approximately 45 minutes ago. "While you were in the waiting room with me." "Yes." Another 2 seconds. "I need you somewhere secure right now. I need you to tell me who inside this hospital has access to the DoD procurement system," she said. "Because the medication tray, my locker, this isn't one person working alone. There's coordination happening in this building, and it's been happening for longer than tonight. We're working the account trace," he said. "It's going to take—" "Don't tell me how long it's going to take. Tell me who has access to medical supply procurement authorizations at Ravenwood." She heard him cover the phone. Muffled exchange with someone she couldn't identify. Then he came back. "Department heads and above. supply chain coordinator, and the hospital administrator who signs off on contracts over a certain dollar threshold. She thought about Ravenwood's administrative structure. She knew it the way she knew everything about this building, through observation, through the landscape of people moving through it, through 2 years of being the person nobody looked at directly. "Who's the administrator on contract authorizations?" she said. "We're still running it." "Voss." "Lena, I need 10 more minutes. I need a name." She heard him exhale. "Vincent Halls, Director of Operational Resources. He's been at Ravenwood for 4 years. Vincent Halls. She knew the name, not personally. They'd never had a conversation, never been in the same room for longer than the incidental duration of a hallway crossing. But she knew his face, his schedule, his habits, in the way that someone who'd spent 2 years being invisible in a building knew everything about it without ever being invited in. Halsey drove a silver SUV, parked in the reserved administrative space near the south entrance, arrived every morning between 7:15 and 7:40. He wore the same 3 suits on rotation. He signed for supply deliveries personally when the amounts exceeded $50,000, which happened twice a month on the large vendor cycles. He had been in the building tonight. She had seen his car in the lot when she arrived at 7 a.m., and it had still been there at midnight, which she'd registered without thinking about it, because Halsey often worked late on budget cycles. "He was here tonight," she said. "How do you know?" "I know his car, silver Lexus SUV, administrative plates, south lot. It was here when I arrived, and it was still here when I walked out to the parking lot." She paused. "After Marcus came in." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "I need you to move," Voss said. "Right now. Do not go anywhere in this building alone. I'm sending—" A sound at the end of the hallway. Not loud, not alarming by itself. Footsteps, a door, the ordinary percussion of a hospital in the small hours. Except she had been in this corridor alone for the last 4 minutes, and the sound was coming from the direction of the stairwell, not the main hall, which was the route that hospital traffic took. The stairwell was where she ate lunch. She knew every sound in that stairwell. "Someone's in the building who shouldn't be," she said quietly. "I'm moving." She moved. Inan. The fastest route to the trauma bay and the surgical floor was through the main corridor, which was monitored and trafficked and lit with the overworked fluorescence of a hospital that never fully slept. She took it at a walk, brisk but not running, because running triggered a different kind of attention than she wanted right now. She was 20 feet from the trauma bay entrance when she heard the overhead page. "Dr. Ferrante to post-op room 3. Dr. Ferrante, post-op room 3. Immediate." She knew Dr. Ferrante's OR. She knew post-op room 3. She knew that Marcus Hale had come out of surgery 40 minutes ago. She changed direction without breaking stride and went toward post-op. The post-op corridor was quieter than the main floor, a wing of the hospital that ran on a reduced overnight staff. 2 nurses on the floor, 1 aide, 1 monitoring tech. Standard for a mid-tier facility at 3 in the morning. She heard the commotion from 30 feet away. Not loud, controlled, but the specific frequency of controlled urgency that happened when clinical staff were managing a situation they didn't fully understand yet. She pushed into post-op room 3. Marcus was in the bed. He was awake. Barely, the glassy, swimming consciousness of someone pulled out of anesthesia, not quite all the way. And his monitor was alarming in 2 separate registers. Dr. Ferrante was at the bedside, her expression locked in the particular concentration of someone diagnosing in real time. "What happened?" Lena said. One of the post-op nurses turned. "This isn't your patient." "What happened?" "BP dropped 50/30, heart rate 120 and climbing. He was stable when I checked 12 minutes ago." Lena was already at the bedside. She looked at the IV line. She looked at the drip rate. She looked at the bag hanging on the pole and the sticker on the bag and the handwriting on the sticker, which was not the standard printed pharmacy label, but a handwritten edition in blue pen. She pulled the line without asking. "What are you doing?" the nurse said. "This bag was changed after he came out of surgery," Lena said. She held it up. "The original post-op fluid order would have been normal saline. This label says NS, but the bag is running clear, and his pressure is dumping like he's been given something vasodilatory." She looked at Ferrante directly. Someone changed this bag. Ferrante came around the bed fast. She took the bag from Lena's hand and looked at the sticker. Something moved across her face. "Get me a tox panel," she said. Not loud. The kind of order that doesn't need volume because the people in the room understand from its texture what it means. "And get pharmacy on the phone right now. I need to know who accessed post-op supply for room 3 in the last hour." The monitor shrieked. Marcus's heart rate spiked to 142 and then the rhythm changed on the display. Not a flatline, not a crash, but an irregularity that Lena recognized with the immediate bodily recognition of pattern. Of all the times she'd watched rhythms destabilize in the worst possible places with the least possible resources. "He's going into a vasovagal cascade," she said. "His vessels are dilating faster than his heart can compensate. Legs up, push fluids, get me epinephrine drawn." She said it to the room, not to anyone specific, which was how she'd been trained to communicate when there wasn't time to identify authority before acting. Ferrante moved. The nurses moved. The aide moved. The rhythm on the monitor continued its ragged, urgent percussion, and Lena put her hand on Marcus's arm. Not a clinical touch, just a hand, a human presence. And she said quietly, to him, because he was awake enough to hear even if he couldn't speak, "You're going to be okay. Stay with me." He didn't respond verbally, but his eyes moved to her and stayed. She kept her hand where it was and talked to Ferrante and watched the monitor and ran the sequence that was already running automatically in the part of her brain that had been doing this since before she had words for it. Epinephrine went in at 3:41 a.m. At 3:44, the rhythm began to stabilize. At 3:48, Marcus's blood pressure was 65/40 and climbing. Ferrante exhaled through her nose. It was the sound of a surgeon who had been holding something in her chest for 8 minutes and was carefully releasing it. "He's going to need observation for the next 2 hours minimum," she said. "I want cardiac consult at first light." "The bag," Lena said, "already going to the lab. The pharmacy access record. I heard you the first time, Whitmore." Ferrante looked at her. Not unkindly. The look of someone who is registering competence and doing the math on it in real time. "Why are you in this hospital at 3:50 in the morning in street clothes?" "I stayed for the update on a patient." "And you happen to know exactly what was wrong with the IV bag." "I noticed the label wasn't standard." Ferrante studied her for a long moment. "Go find Captain Voss," she said. "He's been trying to reach you, and stay in a room with other people." It wasn't phrased as a suggestion. Voss was outside the surgical suite, not the waiting area. He'd moved since her call, which meant he'd been moving since her call. He had 2 men with him now, both in civilian clothes that didn't entirely hide what they were underneath, and his expression when he saw her was the expression of someone who had been working hard to stay analytical and was having a difficult minute with it. "Post-op 3, she said before he could speak. "I know, Ferrante called me." He looked her over in the automatic way of someone checking for damage. "Someone tampered with his IV bag." "Yes, I pulled the line. He's stabilizing." "They went for him again," Voss said, and the flatness in his voice was the deliberate kind. "Same building, 40 minutes after surgery, while I was 20 feet away in a waiting room." He looked away from her, jaw working. "That means they have someone with direct access to post-op supply, and they were willing to use it knowing we were in the building. Which means they're either very confident or very desperate," she said. "Or both." One of the 2 men beside Voss, late 30s, close-cropped hair, the bearing of someone who spent time being extremely quiet in places that rewarded it, leaned in and said something low. Voss nodded once. "We identified the procurement account," Voss said. "The cosigner." She waited. "The account ID traces to an individual who has been at Ravenwood for 6 years. Not Hall's." He paused. "It's registered under the supply chain coordinator, someone named Dora Sen." She knew that name too. Dora Sen was 61, silver-haired, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had a desk near the loading dock administrative office, and a reputation among floor staff for being uncompromising about inventory accuracy. She'd corrected Lena twice in 2 years on supply request forms, politely, efficiently, with the particular satisfaction of someone who knew their systems better than anyone else. She has access to every procurement authorization in the building, Lena said. And to the post-op supply room, Voss said. Her key card was logged accessing it at 3:17 tonight. 3:17. Marcus had come out of surgery at 2:47, a window of 30 minutes. She switched the bag, Lena said. That's what we think. Where is she now? Voss's face answered before his voice did. She wasn't in the building when we ran the check. Her car left the south lot at 3:22. 5 minutes after the bag was switched. Long enough to complete the task, short enough to have an exit ready. She was here tonight, Lena said. After midnight, on a shift she wasn't rostered for. The key card log confirms entry at 11:58 p.m. 11:58. The same timestamp as the photo of her locker. She felt the pieces align with the specific, uncomfortable precision of a mechanism she hadn't built, but was somehow standing inside. She accessed my locker, Lena said. The hospital master key system would give supply chain coordination access to, facilities management has master keys, Voss said. Send coordinates with facilities on storage and delivery. She would know how to get access. They stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite and looked at each other, and the full shape of what had been happening tonight organized itself in the air between them. Dale Morrow outside, with resources and reach and a military logistics network, he'd turned into a private revenue stream. Doris Sen inside, with access to every procurement system and supply room in the building. A medication tray pre-positioned with the wrong concentrations. A post-op bag switched in the 30 minutes after surgery. 2 attempts. 1 patient. They knew he had the documentation, Lena said. And they know the documentation is gone from my locker, so what do they think they have? Control of the evidence chain, Voss said. Without the physical documents, the only thing we have is what Marcus carries in his head and what's on the secured drive. And what I carry in mine, she said. He looked at her carefully. You said you memorized everything. Every name, every date, every coordinate and authorization signature I documented. She paused. I was going to give it to someone who would do something with it. I never found the right person. Voss was quiet for a moment. You found him now. Marcus isn't conscious enough to... Not Marcus. He held her gaze. Me. She looked at him. She did the assessment she always did, the read that wasn't about credentials or rank, but about the thing underneath those things, whether a person was anchored to something more durable than self-interest. She'd read people wrong before. She knew that about herself. She'd also read them right in conditions where being wrong would have killed someone. There's a federal inspector general contact, she said. Military IG, not DOD internal. They're not the same chain that went nowhere last time. If I give you my full documentation and Marcus's files support it, the two together, they're enough, he said. I've already made contact. They've been building a parallel case on Morrow for 8 months. They needed someone with direct field corroboration of the original incident. He paused. They needed Beacon. The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. She thought about the report she'd filed 3 years ago, the names she'd turned in, the careful documentation, the chain of events laid out with the precision of someone who understood that sloppiness in this context meant injustice in the outcome. The weeks she'd spent waiting for a response, and the way the silence had finally resolved into a single conversation with a JAG officer who told her the case had been reviewed and handled internally. Handled. That word had done something to her she hadn't fully named until right now. Why didn't they contact me directly? She said. If the IG was building a case, you disappeared, Voss said. Not accusatory, factual. You left service, changed your name back, took a float position in a mid-sized regional hospital in the Pacific Northwest. It took us 8 months to find you. You said tonight you tracked down 3 people. Witnesses to the Korengal incident. The other 2, he stopped. The other 2 couldn't testify. One died in a car accident 14 months ago. The other is in a coma following a fall that the police report calls inconclusive. The heat that moved through her then wasn't quite anger. It was more specific than that. The particular temperature of understanding that the thing you thought was contained had been active all along, moving at its own pace while you were standing still. 2 witnesses, One dead, one incapacitated. She had been the third. He's been working through the witness list, she said. We believe so. And Sen was his mechanism here. We believe Morrow had Sen in place at Ravenwood specifically because of you, Voss said. She was hired 4 months after you took the float position. Her hiring was sponsored by a consulting firm that we've now traced to a shell company with Morrow's fingerprints on the capitalization. 4 months. She'd been at Ravenwood for 8 months before Dora Sen arrived with her reading glasses and her beaded chain and her precise corrections on supply request forms. Surveillance hadn't started tonight. It had started long before tonight. She needed a moment for that to fully arrive, and she took it, standing in the hallway, because the alternative was not giving it space and having it land wrong later at a moment when she couldn't afford the distraction. Okay, she said. Okay, Voss repeated, uncertain what the word was covering. I need paper, she said, and I need somewhere private. They found an empty consultation room off the post-op corridor. Small, institutional, a table, and 4 chairs and a whiteboard with the ghost of previous diagrams still visible underneath what hadn't quite been erased. One of Voss's men stood outside the door. The other disappeared in the direction of the south lot, which Lena understood was about Sen's vehicle and the question of where she'd gone. Voss found a legal pad in the cabinet under the whiteboard. He put it on the table with a pen and sat across from her. She started writing. Not from notes. She didn't have notes anymore. But from the part of her brain that had been running this file in background for 3 years, the names and dates as clear as they'd ever been, the coordinates precise, the chain of authorization she'd documented moving through her handwriting with the particular fluency of material that had been reviewed so many times it had become structural. She wrote for 45 minutes. Voss didn't interrupt her. He sat across the table and occasionally made a phone call in a voice too low to follow, and occasionally looked at what she was writing and didn't comment. When she put the pen down, her hand ached. She hadn't written that much by hand in years. That's everything I had in the physical documents, she said, plus the timeline I constructed after I filed the report, tracking what happened to each person involved. Voss picked up the legal pad. He read without speaking. She watched his face and saw the moment. Not dramatized, just a slight shift in his jaw. When he reached the section about the 2 men who hadn't come back from the compound and the notation of what Morrow had known and when he'd known it. This is a criminal case, he said. This is not a disciplinary matter. I know. Why didn't the IG receive this the first time you filed? Because the report I filed went to DOD internal review, not the IG. She paused. I didn't know the difference then. I do now. He set the pad down. He looked at her steadily. I'm going to need you to be willing to testify to all of this. I know. It won't be quiet. Whatever Morrow's people know about you, they know my name and my location, and they have my documents. She met his eyes. They don't have my testimony, and they don't have Marcus's files. If you can get both in front of the IG before Morrow's attorneys build a containment argument, we move fast, he said. You move tonight, she said, because right now we're sitting in a hospital where someone who works for Morrow just tried to kill your soldier twice, and the only reason Marcus is alive is luck and timing and the fact that I happened to be restocking Supply Bay 1 when your helicopters landed. She paused. Luck runs out. He pulled out his phone. The consultation room door opened. Not one of Voss's men, she would have heard the knock pattern they'd established. Too short. This was someone else, and the angle of the door and the figure coming through it gave her less than a second to read the situation before she was reading it. Clara Odom. In street clothes, not scrubs, which was wrong on its own. And behind her, not with her, but visible through the doorway before the door swung shut. A man Lena had never spoken to, but whose face she knew from 14 months of parking lot observations. Tall. Silver hair. A suit at 4:15 in the morning. Vincent Halsey. Clara's expression was the expression of a woman who had arrived somewhere she'd been directed to arrive, and was only now, in the instant of arrival, beginning to understand what she'd walked into. I got a call, Clara said. Her voice was off. Not her administrator's voice, not her charge nurse voice. Something smaller. Someone said I needed to come in. That there was a situation with the patient from Bay 1. Who called you, Voss said. The number said it was the hospital operator. Clara. Lena stood up. Listen to me very carefully. Was Vincent Halsey with you when you got the call? Clara blinked. He called me directly. He said, Where is he now? Clara turned to look at the door. Through the narrow window in the consultation room door, the corridor was visible. The spot where Halsey had been standing was empty. Voss was on his feet. He had his phone to his ear, and he was moving toward the door. And outside the door, Lena could hear the sound of his man in the corridor. A sharp exchange, movement, the controlled acceleration of a situation changing faster than the plan accounted for. And under all of it, from somewhere in the direction of post-op, an alarm. Not a standard monitor alarm, not the rhythm of a machine responding to a patient. The specific building-wide register of the security system. The sound that Ravenwood used for exactly one thing, which was a code that Lena had heard tested twice in her 2 years here and never activated in real life. A code indicating an unauthorized person in a secure patient area. Post-op room 3. Marcus. Lena was through the door before Voss finished his sentence, moving down the corridor at a run now, because there was no version of what was happening that rewarded anything less than running, her shoes hitting the linoleum in a rhythm that felt like something she'd been building toward all night, all 2 years, maybe longer than that, and the alarm screaming through the halls of Ravenwood Medical Center in the 4 a.m. dark, and the door to post-op room 3 visible at the end of the corridor with a figure just disappearing through it. She hit the door at full speed. The room was chaos in the specific, concentrated way of a space where something has just happened in the 2 seconds before you arrived. The post-op nurse was against the wall, not hurt but displaced, clearly shoved aside. The monitoring tech was reaching for the call button. Marcus was in the bed, one hand gripping the rail, awake and aware in a way he hadn't been an hour ago. The alarm must have reached him even through the anesthetic fog. Some instinct older than consciousness pulling him toward the surface. At the window, the exterior window that looked out onto the narrow maintenance access corridor between the post-op wing and the parking structure, was a figure. The window was already open, and the figure was going through it. She crossed the room in 4 strides, got to the window in time to see the figure drop to the maintenance walkway below. A 6-foot drop, absorbed with the practiced ease of someone who'd done similar things, and looked back up at her. The face was clear in the parking structure lights. Vincent Halls. He looked up at her for exactly 1 second. Not panicked, not desperate. Something colder than that. The look of a man doing a risk calculation in real time and completing it. Then he looked at something in his hand. A phone. He had a phone in his hand and his thumb was moving, and she understood what he was doing before she'd finished the thought, which was that whatever was on Marcus's secured drive, whatever documentation Voss's unit had brought out of the field, Halsey or Morrow or whoever was on the other end of that phone had just been told where it was or what it contained or enough of what it meant to act on it. "Voss!" she shouted into the corridor without turning from the window. She heard him running. Halsey looked up at her one more time. He said something. She couldn't hear it through the glass, through the alarm, through the 4 a.m. air between them. And then he turned and walked into the parking structure's shadows and was gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She already knew it wasn't going to be a number she recognized. She answered it anyway. The voice that came through was not Morrow's. It was not the voice from the parking lot call. It was a voice she knew, not intimately, not from a personal relationship, but from operational briefings and recorded debriefs and the particular cadence of someone who had spent years projecting authority through chain of command distance. "Whitmore," said Lieutenant Colonel Dale Morrow. "I've been waiting 3 years to have this conversation." She stood at the open window with the alarm still screaming through the building and Dale Morrow's voice in her ear, and made a decision in the space of one breath. She didn't answer him. She pulled the phone away from her ear, looked at the screen, and hit record on the voice memo app she'd downloaded 2 years ago for shift documentation and never deleted. Then she put the phone back to her ear. "I'm here," she said. "Good." His voice was what she remembered, measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who had learned that calm was its own form of power. "I want you to understand that nothing that happened tonight needed to happen. That's on Voss and his people for escalating a situation that could have been managed. Managed, she said. Marcus Hale is alive because I allowed him to be. That's the first thing you need to understand. She looked at the window, at the maintenance walkway, at the parking structure shadows where Halsey had disappeared. Voss was in the doorway behind her now. She heard him, felt the change in the room, and she turned and held up one finger. He stopped. What's the second thing, she said, that you have something I need and I have something you want. A pause. The documents from your locker, I've had people review them. You were thorough, Whitmore, I'll give you that. More thorough than I expected from someone trying to leave everything behind. What do you want? A conversation. A real one, not whatever this is. His tone shifted, almost conversational, in the way that certain kinds of people became conversational when they believed they held the superior position. You have testimony. The IG has been building towards something they don't quite have yet. I know what's on Marcus's drive. I had access to his operational files before he did, frankly. None of it is individually sufficient without corroboration. You want me to withdraw? I want you to understand the landscape, he said. You withdrew once already. You filed a report that went nowhere. You built a life that was small, let's say, and that worked for a while. It can work again. There are other quiet hospitals in other cities. She was very aware of Voss behind her, of the post-op nurse still against the wall, of Marcus in the bed, gripping the rail, watching her with the specific focus of a man who can't contribute to the situation but is tracking every variable he can access. You killed 2 of my people, she said, Sergeant Darren Polk and Corporal Yemi Adisa. You sent them into a compound on intelligence you knew was stale. Silence. That was a command decision made under pressure. It was a decision made to protect a supply arrangement you'd been running for 11 months at that point, she said. The compound was flagged by your own intelligence officer as a potential observation post for Talib elements, who had already identified your procurement route. You sent Polk and Adisa in to confirm what you already knew, so that if they found anything, you could say it was a normal patrol, and if they didn't come back, there was no one left to report what they'd seen. The silence this time was different, longer. The measured calm in his voice when it returned had developed a hairline crack in it. You can't prove intent. I documented every communication I had access to, she said. Every briefing log, every mission record I could legally access, every anomaly in the procurement records that passed through your authorization chain. I've had 3 years to organize it into a sequence that a federal prosecutor won't have any trouble following. She paused. And I'm recording this conversation. He didn't respond immediately. She counted the seconds. That's inadmissible. In some jurisdictions, she said, we're in the Pacific Northwest, one-party consent state. Everything you've said in the last 4 minutes is legally recordable. 3 more seconds. You're making a mistake, he said. And now the crack in the calm was audible. Not panic, not rage, but the specific register of a man recalibrating in real time, running the new numbers, not liking where they landed. I've made mistakes before, she said. The one I made 3 years ago was filing with the wrong office. I'm not going to make it again. She ended the call. Voss crossed the room in 3 steps. She held out the phone, voice memo still running at the bottom of the screen. Morrow, she said. He confirmed knowledge of the procurement arrangement, attempted to offer me an implicit deal to withdraw testimony, and referenced Marcus's drive directly. She paused. He implied he had access to Marcus's operational files before Marcus did. Voss took the phone. He looked at it. That's admission of a security breach inside the unit. Yes. He looked up. That's more than the IG had, she said. Combined with my written documentation in Marcus's drive, it's a prosecutable package. She looked at him steadily. How fast can you get this to your IG contact? Minutes, he said. But Lena... He stopped. Started again. Morrow has people on the ground here. Halsey just went through a window. Sen is in the wind. If he thinks this conversation just... He knows what the recording means, she said, which means he's moving right now. Whatever legal containment he was building, whatever cover story he had ready, he just heard it collapse. Or he escalates. He's already escalated twice tonight, and Marcus is still alive. She looked at the bed. Marcus was still watching. His color was better than it had been 2 hours ago, which was the best thing she could say about the situation. Get the recording to the IG and get someone tracking Morrow's current location. That's already happening, Voss said. He handed the phone back to her and turned to one of his men, and the room became a different kind of busy. Controlled, directional, the organized urgency of people who had been trained to move information faster than consequences. She looked at Marcus. "You got all that?" she said. His voice, when it came, was ragged from intubation and thin from blood loss, and still managed to carry something dry in it. "Most of it," he said. "The alarm made it hard to follow the middle part." "You're going to be fine." "You said that before." It was true before. Still is. She pulled the chair next to his bed and sat in it. "The drive is secure." "The drive is secure," Voss said from across the room without turning around. "I confirmed it 20 minutes ago. Then we have the documentation, my testimony, the procurement records, and a recorded admission," she said. "Morrow's exit routes are closing." Marcus closed his eyes. "Not unconscious. The deliberate close of someone who needs to stop processing for 30 seconds and can finally afford to." "I've been trying to nail that man for 8 months," he said. "I know." "You've been doing it for 3 years. Badly," she said. He opened his eyes. "You're still here." She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that didn't cost more than she wanted to spend right now. At 5 a.m., the hospital began its institutional exhale. The gradual shift between the skeleton overnight crew and the first wave of day staff, footsteps picking up in the hallways, the smell of bad break room coffee beginning its slow diffusion through the ventilation system. Ravenwood woke up without drama, the way hospitals always did, indifferent to what had happened in its corridors 8 hours earlier. Lena sat in the consultation room with a cup of the bad coffee and her legal pad and went through everything she'd written, checking it the way she checked supply counts, methodically, without assuming accuracy, verifying each line against the source material that lived only in her head. It held. Every line of it held. At 5:20, Voss came back into the room with the expression of someone carrying news they haven't sorted into categories yet. "Sen was picked up at the border," he said. "Washington, Idaho. She had a bag, a burner phone, and approximately $40,000 in cash." Lena put the coffee down. "She ran. She ran before Morrow's call to you, which means the exit plan was already in motion. The moment the second attempt on Marcus failed, someone gave her the signal." He sat down. "She's talking." "To who?" "FBI field office. The IG made the referral 90 minutes ago. The recording moved things fast, like you said. The moment Morrow's voice was attached to a direct admission, 3 agencies started returning calls that had been sitting in queues." He rubbed his face with both hands, the first genuinely unguarded movement she'd seen from him all night. "Sen is offering a full account of the procurement arrangement in exchange for sentencing consideration. Names, dates, bank account routing numbers, delivery logs. Morrow's name specifically. Morrow's name specifically, and 8 others." He paused. "2 of them are still active duty." She absorbed that. Active duty personnel. Not retirees, not contractors, people currently inside the machine, currently with access to operational files and mission timelines, currently with the ability to know that Marcus was inbound to Ravenwood tonight. "That's how the route leaked," she said. "We think so. We're still building it." He looked at her. "The IG wants to speak to you directly. Not a deposition, not a formal interview, a call, this morning, before anyone else gets to manage the narrative." "What time?" 6:30. She looked at the clock on the wall. 1 hour and 5 minutes. "Okay," she said. He nodded, then didn't move. She waited. "The report you filed 3 years ago," he said. "The one that went nowhere." "What about it?" "I looked into it this morning. It was received by DOD internal review and logged as a personnel concern about command judgment." He stopped. "It was reviewed by a board that included 2 officers with direct professional ties to Morrow." She'd suspected as much. Suspected it and never been able to confirm it. And now, hearing it stated plainly, felt the particular exhaustion of having been right about a thing she'd wished she was wrong about. "Polk and Adisa," she said. "Their families will be contacted," Voss said. "If the case moves forward the way it looks like it will, the mission circumstances will be re-examined. The official incident report—" He stopped. "The official report classified their deaths as enemy action due to patrol exposure." "I know what it said. It'll be amended." She looked at the coffee cup. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about having something to look at that wasn't his face while she processed the thing that had just been said, which was that two families had spent 3 years being told one version of what had happened, and the process of replacing that version with the accurate one was going to be something those families would have to carry in ways that no amendment to any official record fully addressed. "Good," she said. "That matters." "I know it does." They sat quietly for a moment. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood something about loss without needing to discuss the mechanics of it. At 5:45, the consultation room door opened and Dr. Nolan Pierce came in. He was in his day scrubs, which meant he'd gone home and come back, or he'd been called in, or he'd never left. She couldn't tell which. He looked like a man who had not slept and had stopped pretending that was going to change. He looked at Lena, then at Voss, then at the legal pad on the table, which he didn't read. "I've been briefed on the post-op situation," he said. "The tox panel from Marcus's IV bag came back." He sat down without being invited, which was the first slightly unpierced thing she'd seen him do. Sodium nitroprusside. The bag was spiked with enough to drop a healthy person's blood pressure to dangerous levels, in a post-surgical patient with existing hemodynamic instability. "It would have looked like a surgical complication," Lena said. "A very plausible one." He put his hands flat on the table, "which means someone with enough pharmacological knowledge to get the dosing right and enough access to implement it." He looked at her. "If you hadn't caught it, I caught it." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about the trauma bay. Last night. The time I spent processing your assessment before I acted on it." He stopped. "If you'd been wrong, I would have had a procedural defense, because you're float staff and I'm the attending, but you weren't wrong." "Pierce, I'm not looking for absolution," he said. "I'm saying it out loud because I think it needs to be said out loud." He looked up. "You knew what you were seeing, and I made you wait while I decided whether you were credible." She looked at him. He was a man doing something that people his position and training did not often do easily, which was sit with the fact of an error while the person it had affected was in the room. It cost him something visible. "You acted when it mattered," she said. "That's what counts clinically." "It counts clinically," he agreed. "It's not the only thing that counts." Voss glanced between them with the expression of a man who has stumbled into the edge of something he hadn't anticipated and is uncertain how to position himself relative to it. Pierce stood. "The IG liaison called the hospital administrator 40 minutes ago. You should know that. It won't stay quiet inside the building." He paused. "Clara Odom has been asking about you since she got here. She came in at 5:15. What's she asking? She wants to know what's happening and whether you're okay." He paused. "I told her you were here and you were fine and she should wait." "That's probably right," Lena said. He nodded once and left. Clara was waiting in the hallway outside the consultation room, which was exactly where Pierce had told her to wait, and also exactly the kind of thing Clara Odom did. She complied with directions, and she did it in the most proximate way technically permitted. Lena came out at 6:10, 20 minutes before the IG call. Clara looked at her, straight on, fully, in a way that was different from the assessing glances of the last 2 years. She had bags under her eyes, and her hair was not in its usual arrangement, and she was holding a paper coffee cup in both hands. "Someone used me," she said. Not a question. "Yes. Halsa called me, said there was a patient concern in post-op, asked me to come in." Her jaw tightened. "He used my name to get through the post-op corridor. The nursing staff would have assumed I'd authorized whatever he was doing." "Yes. I didn't know." "I know you didn't." Clara looked at the floor, then back up. "I've been trying to work out what I missed, whether there were signs with Halsey that I should have—" She stopped. I don't think I would have caught it. He was careful. He was very careful, Lena agreed. He'd been in place for 4 years. That's not actually what I've been thinking about. Clara straightened, the way she straightened when she was about to say something she'd organized. I've been thinking about the review I initiated, about what I told patient advocacy, about the way I spoke to you in the supply closet last night. Lena waited. I had made a decision about what you were, Clara said, early. I made it and I maintained it because I'm someone who maintains positions once I've formed them, and that's useful in some contexts, and in this one it was... She stopped. It was wrong, and it potentially made things worse in that trauma bay. It didn't cost Marcus his life, Lena said. That's what matters. That's a very generous framing. It's an accurate one. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who wants to push back on being let off easily, and is also aware that pushing back in that direction has its own problems. The review, Clara said. I'm going to withdraw the patient advocacy referral and submit a corrected incident report. What happened in that bay should be documented as a consultation, which is what it actually was. She paused. I'll need your cooperation with the accurate account. You'll have it, Lena said. Clara nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else and either hadn't found it yet or had decided not to. She turned to leave. Clara. She stopped. The squeaky wheel on supply cart 4, Lena said. I've been meaning to report it for 6 weeks. Clara looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. The thing that lives in the face before the face decides to commit. I'll put in a maintenance order, she said. She left. To Mountain. The IG call lasted 47 minutes. She sat in the consultation room with Voss present and a federal investigator named Tolliver on the line who asked questions the way good investigators asked questions. Not to hear what they already knew, but to identify what they didn't. She gave him everything she'd written on the legal pad, and then the parts she'd organized but not written, the contextual material, the timeline of what had happened to the other 2 witnesses, the call with Morrow and what he'd said, and what his phrasing implied about the scope of what he'd thought he controlled. Tolliver asked about Dale Morrow's reassignment 3 years ago. She described what she'd documented, what she'd been told, and the gap between those 2 things. The IG office received a report filed under your name approximately 3 years ago, Tolliver said. It was flagged for internal DoD review, and the review was conducted by a panel that included one officer with a personal connection to Morrow and one with a professional one. The review finding was that your concerns reflected command disagreement rather than misconduct. I know what the finding was. The officer who made that finding retired 14 months ago, Tolliver said. He's been subpoenaed in a separate matter that I can't discuss, but the connection to Morrow's network is being examined. A pause. Your original report is being reopened as primary evidence in the federal case. She looked at the wall, the ghost diagrams on the whiteboard, the fluorescent light that had been flickering since she sat down. I want Paulk and Adisa's families to know the truth, she said, before anything else is public, before the press gets whatever they're going to get. Those families have been living with the wrong story for 3 years. That's a casualty notification process, Tolliver said. It goes through the Army, and it's not something I control directly, but I'll flag it as a priority. Flag it harder than that, she said. A pause on the line. I'll make sure it happens before any public statement. Thank you. When the call ended, she sat with her hands in her lap and breathed for a moment. Just that. Voss was quiet across the table, and she appreciated the quiet because it was the good kind. The kind that respected what had just been said rather than rushing past it. It's going to take time, he said, finally. I know. Trials, depositions, hearings. Morrow's going to fight it. He has attorneys and he has resources, and he's going to try to narrow the scope of what they can charge. He recorded himself admitting knowledge of the arrangement, she said. To me. To a one-party consent recording. She paused. His attorneys are going to have a bad year. Something shifted in Voss's face. Something that had been held in controlled position all night briefly released. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more specific than that. At 7:40 a.m., Lena went to see Marcus. He'd been moved to a private room on the post-op floor with Voss's man outside the door, which had not changed and would not change until certain logistical decisions had been made about his security situation. He was more awake than he'd been at any point in the previous 6 hours, which was relative. He looked like a person who had been through surgery and a blood pressure crisis and was doing the work of existing in a body that had taken significant damage. She stood inside the door and didn't sit. "How are you actually?" she said. "Worse than I'm going to say to Voss," he said. "Better than I was 2 hours ago." "That's something." "You were the one who caught the bag." "Yes." He looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who'd been paying attention through conditions that made attention difficult. And what was in them was a specific kind of acknowledgement. Not gratitude exactly, which was an emotion that sometimes came with performance attached, but something quieter. "I know who you are," he said. "I read the file before the op. Every op. I read the files on anyone who might be relevant in the field." He paused. "I knew Beacon was at Ravenwood before we flew out." She absorbed that. Voss knew too. Voss has known for a month. We'd been building toward making contact. He shifted in the bed slightly and his face registered the adjustment. The plan was supposed to be less dramatic. Plans usually are. "The woman in the file," he said, "the combat medic who documented Korengal, who filed the report." He stopped. "I read what happened to the other 2 witnesses, Garner and Whitfield." She'd known their names for 3 years. She'd tracked what happened to them the way she'd tracked everything else. Not obsessively, but consistently, because knowing was better than not knowing even when what you knew was terrible. "I know," she said. "They found me because I was looking for what you'd already found," he said. "The procurement diversion was the thread. But the thread started with what you documented 3 years ago." She thought about that. About the report that had gone nowhere, filed with the wrong office, reviewed by compromised people, generating a finding that sent her home with nothing. About the 2 years in Ravenwood with the cart and the stairwell lunches, and the squeaky wheel, about how the work had been true even when the outcome had been wrong. "Rest," she said. "You need it more than this conversation." "Yeah," he said. He closed his eyes. "Thank you, Whitmore." She left before he could open them again. The hospital administrator's office was on the 4th floor, administrative wing, a corner room with windows that looked out over the parking structure and, beyond it, the foothills and the gray morning light. Lena had never been in it. She had no particular desire to be in it now, but the message had come through Pierce, and Pierce had framed it as something she should do, and she'd agreed with his reasoning. Hospital Administrator Gordon Falk was in his 60s, heavy-set, with the expression of a man who had received too much information in too short a time and was managing it poorly. He'd been administrator at Ravenwood for 11 years. He had not, as far as the preliminary investigation could determine, been aware of Vincent Hals's arrangement with Morrow. He was, however, now aware of everything, and that awareness had visibly rearranged him overnight. He stood when she came in, which she noted without comment. "Ms. Whitmore," he gestured to the chair across his desk. "Please." She sat. "I've been on the phone with the hospital's legal counsel and with the federal liaison since 5 this morning," he said. "I want you to know that Ravenwood's full cooperation is being offered to the IG and the FBI. Vincent Hals's employment has been terminated and the procurement records have been frozen pending review." "Good," she said. "I also want to address the review that was initiated last night regarding your actions in the trauma bay." He folded his hands on the desk. "That review is being withdrawn. Dr. Pierce submitted a revised clinical incident report classifying your intervention as a formal consultation to the attending physician. Charge Nurse Odom concurred." He paused. "The review found no violation of scope of practice." "I know, Clara told me." He looked slightly uncertain, which meant he'd been expecting to deliver that information and had prepared something around it. She let him recover. "We'd like to discuss your position here going forward," he said. "Your current float assignment ends in 3 weeks. We'd like to offer you a permanent position in our trauma department. The position would include a title adjustment, a salary commensurate with the full extent of your qualifications and experience." She looked at him. "What's the title?" "Trauma Specialist Nurse. It's a non-physician clinical leadership role." He paused. "Dr. Pierce suggested it. Dr. Ferrante seconded it. She thought about the supply cart, the locker room, the stairwell. 2 years of deliberate smallness that had turned out not to be what she'd thought it was. She thought about what Morrow had said on the phone. Other quiet hospitals, other cities. "I need to think about it," she said. Falk nodded. "Of course. How long do I have?" "As long as you need," he said, and said it like he meant it, which might have been true or might have been the thing you said when federal investigators had been in your building for 6 hours and you were very interested in being cooperative in every available direction. She stood. "One more thing." He looked up. "Dora Sen's desk," she said, "near the loading dock. There's a file cabinet with a combination lock. Your legal team is going to want to flag it for the investigators before the building opens fully today." She paused. "The combination is the last 4 digits of the hospital's original contractor license number. She used it for everything. I noticed it on her computer password prompt 8 months ago." She held his look. "Shaisu. 2 years of restocking supply carts will teach you things about a building that organizational charts don't cover." She left him with that and walked toward the elevator. The hallway on the administrative floor was quiet in the way that floors are quiet when everyone in them is in their offices on the phone. She passed Hals's former office. Door closed, a strip of yellow evidence tape she hadn't expected to see already across the frame. FBI doing its work faster than she'd anticipated. She stood at the elevator and pressed the button and waited. Her phone buzzed. Not unknown this time. Voss. Morrow's been located. Federal marshals out of Portland. He tried to cross into Oregon on I-84 at approximately 6 a.m. He's in custody. She read it twice. The elevator came. She got in. The doors closed and she rode down with the phone in her hand and the message on the screen, and she was aware of something in her chest that was not relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for what you felt when something you'd carried for 3 years finally stopped moving. It was something more like the end of a held breath, the moment after you exhale and before you decide what the next one means. The elevator opened on the ground floor. Clara was waiting near the nursing station with a clipboard, which meant she had already returned to her domain and was running it in the way she ran it, which was competently and with total commitment and the slight rigidity of a person who had never quite learned to manage the relationship between structure and uncertainty. She looked at Lena. "Your cart," she said. "Supply cart 4. Maintenance put it at the back of the storage room. They marked the wheel for replacement." "Thank you. Your shift starts in..." Clara glanced at the clock. 22 minutes. Lena looked at her, looked at the nursing station, the hallway, the particular morning light that came through the east windows and hit the floor in a way she'd seen every day for 2 years without ever particularly registering it. "I know," she said. She went to the locker room and put on her scrubs. She tied her shoes, she clipped her badge to her pocket. Float staff, the same badge she'd worn for 2 years. The badge that had been used as a shorthand for a category of person that the people using it had not understood. She picked up the supply cart. The wheel had been replaced overnight. It rolled straight and quiet. She pushed it down the hallway toward Bay 1. At the East Corridor Junction, she passed 2 nurses from the overnight shift finishing their handoff. They glanced at her badge, and for the first time in 2 years, one of them, a young nurse named Tasha, who Lena had covered for twice during double shift weeks, said her name. Whitmore. Tasha looked at her fully, not at the badge. "You doing okay?" "Working on it," Lena said. It was the most accurate answer she had. She pushed the cart around the corner toward the supply room and her phone buzzed again. And she didn't look at it immediately because she had a supply count to finish, and Bay 1 was short on hemostatic gauze, and the morning trauma team would need it ready. When she did look, it was another message from Voss. Morrow waved the federal public defender. Hired outside counsel, the same firm that handled his DOD reassignment 3 years ago. His first statement through the attorneys came in 20 minutes ago. She read the next line. He's claiming the Korengal incident was authorized at a level above his command. He's naming a general officer. She stopped pushing the cart. She stood in the hallway of Ravenwood Medical Center in the early morning with the supply cart in front of her and the phone in her hand, and she thought about the report she'd filed, the chain of command she'd sent it up, and every level of that chain she had not been able to see from where she was standing. She thought about a general officer. She thought about how the thing she'd believed was contained had always been larger than what she could see from the ground. Her next breath came in slowly and went out the same way. She typed back, "How high?" Voss's response arrived in 11 seconds. High enough that Tolliver just told me this case is no longer a federal case. It's been redesignated. Joint Task Force, DODIG, FBI, and one other agency that Tolliver won't name on an unsecured line. She looked at the message. Read it again. They want you in Washington, D.C., Lena, not as a witness, as a consultant. They want Beacon. The supply cart stood in the hallway. Bay 1 waited at the end of the corridor. The morning was fully arrived now, the hospital filling with the sound of its own ordinary urgency. Monitors, footsteps, the soft machinery of a building doing what buildings like this existed to do. She put the phone in her pocket. She had a supply count to finish. And then, after that, she was going to have to decide something she had not made a decision about in 3 years. She finished the supply count. It took 11 minutes. She counted every bag, every kit, every medication tray, checked concentrations, checked expiration dates, marked the shortage on her clipboard, and submitted the reorder request through the system the way she had done hundreds of times. She did it completely and accurately and without rushing, because the work was the work, regardless of what was waiting on the other side of it. When she was done, she pushed the cart back to its position against the east wall, wrote up the maintenance note about the wheel replacement for the log, and stood in the supply room for a moment with her hands at her sides. Washington, D.C., not as a witness, as a consultant. She had spent 3 years building a life premised on the idea that she was done being Beacon. That Beacon was a name that belonged to a version of herself that had cost more than it returned, a version defined by exceptional competence in terrible circumstances, by knowing exactly what to do when everything was going wrong, by being the person who stepped forward when everyone else was still deciding. She had tried, genuinely tried, to be someone smaller than that. The cart had a new wheel that rolled straight and quiet. She left the supply room and went to find Voss. He was in the hallway outside surgical, where she'd found him at the beginning of all this, and the symmetry of that was not lost on her. He had a better cup of coffee than anything the hospital break room produced, which meant someone had made a run, and he held it out to her when she approached with the straightforward practicality of a man who understood that certain conversations went better with caffeine. She took it. "Tell me about the general," she said. "Brigadier General Arlen Cusick," Voss said, "retired 14 months ago." He paused. The same month that Thomas Garner died in a car accident. She heard the implication land in the air between them without either of them stating it directly. "Cusick was Morrow's chain of command during the Korengal rotation," she said. He was. And according to what Morrow's attorneys communicated this morning, Cusick was the origin point of the arrangement, not Morrow. Morrow is claiming he was operating under direct verbal authorization from Cusick, that the procurement diversion was framed to him as a classified supplemental funding mechanism. Voss held her gaze. "Which may or may not be true." "It's at least partly true," she said. He waited. "The briefing where Morrow sent Polk and Adisa into the compound," she said. "I was in the outer room. I heard Morrow on the radio with his commanding officer before the order went out. I documented it, but I documented it as Morrow's call because I couldn't confirm who was on the other end of the transmission." She looked at the coffee. "If Cusick was giving him authorization in real time, then I only saw the middle of the chain." "That testimony becomes critical," Voss said, "because if Cusick can be tied to the operational decision and not just the financial arrangement, the charge profile changes significantly." "Garner and Whitfield," she said, "were they positioned to corroborate Cusick specifically?" "Garner was. He was in communications that rotation. He would have had access to transmission logs." Voss's voice stayed flat and deliberate. "Those logs were archived and then redacted in a security review 18 months ago. The review was authorized by Cusick," she said. "The retirement paperwork cleared before anyone noticed the sequence." She drank the coffee. It was good, which seemed almost rude given the nature of the conversation it was accompanying. "The task force," she said. "The third agency Tolliver won't name." "Defense Intelligence," Voss said. "I'm speculating, but it's an informed speculation. Cusick has ties to two foreign defense contractors that were identified in a separate investigation 3 years ago. If the procurement diversion was feeding into a network that extended beyond domestic profit, then this isn't just corruption, she said. It's a security matter. Which is why they want Beacon in Washington, he said. Not just your testimony, your read, your knowledge of the operational context, the personnel, the decisions as they were made on the ground. He paused. You were there, Lena. You saw things that weren't in any report because you didn't know at the time that they were relevant. She thought about the things she hadn't put in her original report, the peripheral details, the texture of the rotation that she'd filed as background and moved past because the report was about specific documented events, and she was trying to be precise, not comprehensive, the way Morrow had handled certain communications personally rather than through standard channels. The supply requisitions that had moved faster than they should have given the approval queue, the contractor vehicles she'd seen twice near the forward operating base that hadn't matched any of the logistical manifests she had access to. Details. At the time, details. I need 3 days, she said. Voss looked at her. For what? To finish my shift, to talk to Falk about the position offer, to sleep more than 90 minutes. She handed the coffee back. And to write down everything I remember that I didn't put in the original report, because there's more than what's on that legal pad, and I want it documented before I get into a room with federal investigators who are very good at shaping what they hear. He took the coffee back. 3 days, he said. And I want something in writing from the task force about what my role is and what it isn't, she said. I'm a consultant. I'm not re-enlisting. I'm not becoming an operational asset. I talk to investigators. I give testimony. I provide context. That's the scope. I'll get it in writing. Today. Today, he agreed. Marcus was moved to a standard recovery room on the 3rd floor at 9 a.m., which meant he'd been upgraded from critical observation to stable recovery, which meant the people making those determinations had decided his body was doing the work it needed to do. Lena stopped in at 9:15 between tasks, and he was sitting up fractionally. Not comfortable. The human body was not designed for the things that had been done to his recently, but upright enough to indicate he was in the process of returning to himself. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression was the expression of someone who had been thinking. Voss told me, he said, about Washington. He shouldn't have. He tells me everything. We've worked together for 4 years. He paused. Are you going? I'm going, she said. She'd made the decision somewhere in the supply room and hadn't been entirely aware of it until this moment, hearing herself say it out loud. With conditions. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. For what it's worth, he said, I think Cusick is going to try to construct an authorization defense. He has the resources for it, and he's smart enough to know that Morrow's testimony alone is self-serving and therefore contestable. I know. Your corroboration of the operational context isn't just additive, he said. It's the thing that makes the financial documentation mean something. Anyone can claim they were authorized to divert funds. The question is whether the people doing the authorizing had reasons to need the operation to succeed at any cost. He looked at her. You saw what that cost looked like on the ground. I did. Polkanadiza, he said. Not as a question, as an acknowledgement. The names in the air, said by someone who had read the file and understood what they meant. Yes, she said. I want to be in the room when Cusick is charged, Marcus said. I know that's not how it works. I'm just saying it. I know, she said. Get some sleep. You too at some point. Working on it, she said, for the second time that morning. The formal charging documents for Dale Morrow were filed in federal court in Portland at 11:40 a.m. Lena learned this from Tolliver, who called her directly for the first time, with a voice that was more human than it had been on the 6:30 call. The particular quality of a federal investigator who has been working a case for 8 months and has just watched the first formal piece of it lock into place. The charges included federal procurement fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and, the one that made her breathe differently when she heard it, negligent homicide charges related to the Korengal incident, filed under the military accountability provisions that most people outside the legal system didn't know existed. Garner's family was notified this morning, Tolliver said, before the filing, as promised. And Whitfield? Leonard Whitfield had been in a care facility in Spokane for 14 months, minimally conscious, with a family that had been told his fall was an accident. His wife was called this morning, Tolliver said. The fall is being re-examined. I can't speak to where that goes legally yet, but she has representation now and she knows the full picture. Lena stood in the break room with the phone against her ear and thought about Whitfield's wife, hearing that the accident had not been an accident, and about the particular terrible complexity of that news, that something that had happened to someone you loved was worse than you'd been told, which was its own kind of grief, but was also the truth, and the truth was what allowed accountability to follow. Darren Polk's mother, she said, and Yemi Adisa's husband. Both notified, Tolliver said. Casualty notification officers, formal process. The incident report amendment is being processed. It will officially reclassify their deaths as resulting from command negligence pending the outcome of the criminal case. That's not the same as it being in their service records permanently? No, it'll take the conviction. He paused. But it's going to get there, Whitmore. We have what we need to get there. She believed him. Not completely. She'd believed institutional processes before and been wrong about what they could carry through. But enough. Enough to work with. After she ended the call, she sat down at the break room table and did nothing for 3 minutes. Not thinking, not planning, just sitting, because some things needed a moment before you moved past them, and the families of Polk and Adisa having received the truth after 3 years was one of those things. Tasha came in to heat up something and glanced at her. You okay? Yeah, Lena said. Yeah, I am. And it was close enough to true that she didn't feel the need to qualify it. The news broke publicly at 2 p.m. Not through a press release, through a reporter who had a federal court contact and got to the charging documents within 90 minutes of filing. By 2:15, it had moved from a regional legal brief to a national wire story. Former Army Lieutenant Colonel charged with procurement fraud, conspiracy, and negligent homicide in connection with overseas deaths. By 3 p.m., Ravenwood Medical Center was mentioned. Not prominently. The story was about Morrow and Cusick, who had been formally named in the filing as an unindicted co-conspirator with an implied indication that his own charges were pending. But the hospital appeared in the context of the attempted murder of the witness who had brought the medical documentation forward, and in that context, Beacon appeared. Not by name. The story said a military-trained nurse at the facility and left it there because Tolliver's office had requested it and the reporter had honored it, for now. But the people inside Ravenwood knew. She was at the nursing station at 3:20 when she became aware that the texture of the floor had changed. Not noisier, almost quieter, the specific quiet of people who are processing something and haven't decided what to do with it yet. 2 nurses she'd worked beside for 2 years without substantial conversation were looking at her differently, not intrusively, carefully. With the careful look of people revising something they'd built without realizing they were building it. Pierce found her at 3:45. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know that however you answer it, I'm going to respect the answer. She waited. The trauma specialist position that Falk offered you this morning, he said. I recommended it. Ferrante co-signed. Clara concurred. He looked at her directly. But I want to know if you want it. Not if it's the right thing, not if it makes sense given the circumstances. If you want it. She thought about Washington, about testimony and task forces and rooms full of people with the authority to finally do something about the things she'd been carrying. She thought about Marcus in the post-op room, about Tasha saying her name in the hallway this morning and meaning it. I don't know yet, she said. I'm going to Washington first. I'll know better after. That's an honest answer, he said. It's the only kind I have. He nodded. The offer doesn't expire, he said. Falk's going to say it does because that's how he manages timelines, but I'll make sure it doesn't. A pause. You've been in this building for 2 years. Whatever was going on underneath that, you were here every day. You know this place. I know its supply rooms, she said. You know its people, he said. That's harder to acquire. He left. She stood at the nursing station and looked at the hallway and thought about what he'd said and whether it was true. and decided that it probably was, in the way that things you observed from a remove for long enough eventually stopped being observation and started being knowledge. Dora Sen's plea agreement was finalized and made public on the third day. Lena read the summary on her phone, sitting in the airport, waiting for a flight to Washington that Voss had booked and the task force had confirmed, and that represented the most direct version of a direction she'd been moving toward for 3 years without knowing the destination. The agreement covered Sen's full cooperation in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that capped at 7 years. In exchange, she provided complete documentation of the procurement account, the routing of funds through the shell company, the chain of communication between herself and Halls and Morrow, and a detailed account of every action she had taken at Ravenwood in relation to the arrangement, including the locker access, the medication tray, and the post-op bag. The plea made national news by midday, not because of Sen specifically. She was the operational detail, the mechanism, but because her cooperation directly corroborated Morrow's financial trail and added hospital-level documentation to a federal case that was now being described by legal commentators as one of the most comprehensive military corruption indictments in a decade. Vincent Halls had been arrested at a motel in Medford, Oregon, 47 hours after he went through the post-op window. He was facing federal charges including conspiracy to commit murder, the bag, the medication tray, the deliberateness of 2 targeted attempts constituting sufficient grounds for the charge under the federal statute. He had not entered a plea. His attorney had issued a statement describing him as a peripheral actor with limited knowledge of the scope of the arrangement, which Sen's plea agreement had already rendered factually incorrect. She put her phone away when they called her boarding group. She carried 2 things onto the plane, her bag and the zippered case that Morrow's people had taken from her locker and that had been recovered from Sen's car when she was picked up at the Washington-Idaho border. The documents inside were slightly disordered. Someone had gone through them, photographed them, used them, but they were intact. She put them in the overhead bin and sat down and looked out the window at the gray Callaway sky and thought about the fact that she had driven to the airport in her own car, taken the long-term parking shuttle, eaten a breakfast sandwich from the terminal kiosk that was slightly stale and completely adequate. Normal. All of it brutally, specifically normal, except for the part where it wasn't. She fell asleep before takeoff and woke up over eastern Oregon. The landscape changed from green to the high desert's brown and gold, and she felt, in a way she couldn't have named precisely, that the border between those 2 things had been crossed somewhere during the sleep. Washington was what Washington always was, dense with intention, full of people who walked like their next meeting was slightly more important than their current one. Tolliver met her at the federal building in person, which she'd appreciated, because phone voices translated to physical presences in ways that were sometimes off and sometimes not. And Tolliver turned out to be exactly the person his phone voice had suggested. Compact, direct, the kind of tired that came from years of caring about something. The first session lasted 4 hours. She talked, and they recorded, and she didn't soften anything or hedge anything or frame anything in terms she thought they wanted to hear. She talked about Korengal the way she'd experienced it, with the irreducible texture of being there, the heat and the logistics and the specific quality of bad decision-making under pressure, which was different from bad decision-making in comfort, and how she had distinguished between the 2 in real time. She talked about Morrow's command patterns, about Cusick's communication style when he believed he wasn't being documented, about the contractor vehicles she'd seen and the supply movements that hadn't matched the manifests and the way certain communications had been handled in person rather than through channels that created records. She talked about Polk and Adiza. She said their names in a federal building, on a recording that would be entered into a prosecutorial file, in front of people with the actual authority to make those names mean something in a legal proceeding. She talked about them as soldiers, their competence, their specific skills, the particular qualities that had made them good at what they did, and that made their loss the kind of loss that didn't close. At the end of the 4 hours, Tolliver put down his pen. "I want to tell you something," he said. "The report you filed 3 years ago was received by DOD Internal Review and deliberately misdirected by an officer whose name is now in our case files as a co-conspirator." He looked at her steadily. "You did everything right. The system failed, not the report." She had known this. She had suspected it and then confirmed it over the course of the past week, and knowing it had not changed the 3 years that had happened in its wake, But hearing it said plainly, in this room, by someone with the standing to say it, was different from knowing it. "I need to know that it doesn't happen this time," she said. "The case is insulated from internal DoD review," he said. "That's why it's a joint task force. No single agency has unilateral authority over the case file." He paused. "The Inspector General's office has congressional oversight on this one. There's no version of misdirection available." She nodded. "Then let's finish it." General Arlen Cusick was indicted on the 41st day after Marcus Hale arrived at Ravenwood Medical Center. The charges included conspiracy to commit procurement fraud, obstruction of justice, 2 counts of accessory to negligent homicide, and a national security charge that the indictment described only as relating to the unauthorized disclosure of military operational information to foreign commercial entities, which was the careful legal language for what had been confirmed in the weeks of investigation. That a portion of the diverted procurement funds had been channeled through a defense contractor with foreign government ties, and that Cusick had facilitated that channel in exchange for post-retirement consulting arrangements worth several $1,000,000. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it was the primary story on every national network. Lena watched the press conference from a hotel room in Washington, a brief one, Tolliver's office, and the FBI joint statement, careful and precise in the way federal legal proceedings required public statements to be. Cusick's attorney immediately issued a response claiming the charges were without merit and that his client looked forward to his day in court, which was what attorneys always said, and which in this case had a particular hollowness given the scale of what had been filed. She turned off the television. She sat in the quiet of the hotel room and thought about what happened now. Not in the abstract sense. The legal proceedings would proceed. Morrow's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Cusick's would likely follow. Sen and Halsey would be sentenced under their respective agreements and pleas. That machinery was in motion, and she had done what she could to fuel it, and it would run without her constant attendance. She thought about what happened to her now. She thought about who she was on the other side of this. Not Beacon. That was the name the military had given to a set of skills deployed in a context that had both required those skills and ultimately cost her something she hadn't known she was spending. Not the float nurse with the supply cart, because that had been a version of herself built for a specific purpose that had quietly stopped serving the purpose it was built for somewhere in the second year. Something in between. Something that contained both and reduced to neither. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. Walked the length of the hallway today without stopping. Ferrante says 3 more weeks. Voss is already making noises about next assignments. I told him to wait till I can do stairs. She smiled at the phone. Actually smiled. Not the controlled, minimum expression default she'd worn for 2 years, but a real one. The kind that arrived without permission. She typed back, "Don't let him rush you." His response was immediate. Says the woman who flew to D.C. 4 days after working a 30-hour shift. She put the phone down. She called Falk from the hotel room that evening. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting for the call or something like it, which was the kind of administrator move she'd already filed under, expected. "The position," she said. "Trauma specialist nurse. Pierce told me it wouldn't expire." "It won't," Falk said, and had the grace not to add any conditions to it. "I'm going to take it," she said. "I'll be back in Callaway in 10 days. I have 2 more sessions with the task force, and then I'm done here until the trial preparation phase, which is months out. We'll have everything ready," he said. "I need one thing changed," she said. "What's that?" "The float designation on my badge," she said. "I'd like it updated." A pause. "Of course," he said. "What do you want it to say?" She thought about what the badge meant and what it had meant for 2 years and what it would mean now. Not as a category, but as an identifier, a true one. "My name," she said. "Just my name and the department." He said he'd have it ready. She ended the call and sat with the quiet for a while longer, because she'd earned the quiet and she'd learned in the past 10 days that earning something and claiming it were 2 different actions and both required intention. She pulled the zippered case from her bag. She opened it. The documents were all there. The timeline, the names, The chain of evidence she'd reconstructed from memory onto a legal pad in a consultation room in Ravenwood at 3 in the morning. She looked at the pages for a long time. Then she put them back in the case and put the case in her bag, because they weren't a burden anymore. They were a record. They had served the purpose she'd always meant them to serve, and now they would go into a federal evidence archive and sit there as the permanent, accurate account of what had happened and what it had cost. Darren Polk, Yemi Adisa, Thomas Garner, Leonard Whitfield, still in a facility in Spokane, whose wife now knew the truth. She did not pretend that the indictments were the same as what had been lost. She knew better than that, had always known better than that. And part of what she'd been carrying for 3 years was the knowledge that accountability and restoration were not the same territory, that you could achieve the first and still grieve the distance between them and the second. But accountability was real. It was what was possible, and it had not been available until she stopped disappearing. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not heroism, not the grand narrative of vindication that other people might construct around what had happened at Ravenwood on the night 3 helicopters landed. She had not stepped forward in the trauma bay because she had decided to reclaim herself or because she'd been ready to stop hiding. She had stepped forward because a man was dying and she knew what was wrong, and the distance between knowing and doing had been approximately 0 once she understood the stakes. That was who she was. She had spent 2 years trying to be someone quieter than that, and the trying had been genuine, and the quieter life had given her things she hadn't had before. Rest, distance, the slow-burning education of watching a place and its people without being asked to perform in it. Those weren't wasted years. They were data. They were the particular kind of knowledge that came from being the person nobody looked at, while the people nobody watched everyone else. And then a supply cart had a squeaky wheel, and she had meant to report it for 6 weeks, and 3 helicopters had screamed out of the dark, and she had not been able to do anything except exactly what she was. She flew back to Callaway on a Thursday. The airport was the same airport. The long-term parking shuttle was the same shuttle. The drive to Ravenwood took 22 minutes in light morning traffic, and she took the long way without meaning to, through the neighborhood north of the hospital, where the older houses sat close to the road, and the trees were starting to change color at the tips, and it occurred to her that she had not actually looked at Callaway very often in 2 years, had moved through it with the efficiency of someone using a place rather than inhabiting it. She looked at it now. It was an ordinary city in the Pacific Northwest where it rained 8 months out of the year, and the hospital parking lot flooded every February. It was not remarkable. It contained people who were doing the ordinary business of their lives with the full weight of human complexity that ordinary business required. And one of those people had been her, in a way she'd been trying to minimize. She parked in Section D. She clipped the new badge to her pocket before she got out of the car. Her name, the department, trauma. She pushed through the doors. The morning shift was in full motion, the specific controlled energy of a hospital starting its day. Handoffs in process, the coffee already bad, the fluorescent lights indifferent to what they illuminated. She walked through it, and it moved around her the way water moves around something that has found its position. Tasha was at the nursing station. She looked up. "Whitmore," she said. "Welcome back." "Thanks," Lena said. "What do we have?" "Bay 2 has a fracture reduction pending. Bay 1 is clear." Tasha paused. "Supply cart 4 is restocked, but the east corridor is short on wound irrigation kits." "I'll pull them," Lena said. She went to the supply room. She knew where everything was. She had known for 2 years, and knowing things was not the same as being known, but it was a foundation, the kind you could build from if you were willing to be seen in the process of building. She pulled the irrigation kits and carried them to the east corridor and restocked the cabinet and checked the adjacent cabinet while she was there, because that was what thoroughness looked like in practice, which was not dramatic and not clean, and was almost always the thing that mattered. The morning went on. A patient came in, then another. She worked alongside people she had worked alongside for 2 years, and the work was the same work and she was the same person, which was also a different person. And the difference was not in what she could do, but in whether she allowed what she could do to be visible. That was the thing nobody warned you about, not the hiding. The hiding was understandable, even reasonable. a response to being somewhere that had required more than you had left to give. What nobody warned you about was what it cost other people when you stayed hidden. Not just the dramatic cost, the man on the gurney who needed someone who could read his injury pattern. The daily cost. The people around you building a picture of who you were from the corner of you that you chose to show, and then acting on that picture in ways that shaped both their understanding and yours. She had let Clara Odom decide what she was. She had not corrected the impression, not challenged it, not offered any version of herself that went against the category Clara had built. That wasn't humility. It was absence. She had been absent from her own life for 2 years, and the people around her had filled the gap with whatever fit the space, and she couldn't be angry about that without acknowledging her own contribution to it. She wasn't angry. She was done. At noon, Marcus texted her a photo. He was in the hallway of his recovery floor, standing without support, one hand hovering near the wall in the cautious proximity of a man who was not entirely sure his legs would cooperate, but was trying anyway. The expression on his face was the expression of someone winning an argument with their own body. She texted back, "Stairs tomorrow." His response, "Deal." She pocketed the phone and went back to work. At 4:30, Pierce stopped her in the hallway. He looked at her badge. Not the way he'd looked at it before, not the assessing, categorizing glance. He looked at it the way you look at something that has finally been correctly labeled. "Good to have you back," he said. "I wasn't gone long." "No," he said. "But you came back differently." She thought about how to answer that, whether it was true and in what way, and whether it was the kind of thing that needed answering out loud. "I came back as myself," she said. "That's different from before." He nodded once and left her to the rest of the shift. She finished at 7. She changed out of her scrubs. She put her badge in her pocket instead of leaving it in the locker, because it was hers, and it said what it was supposed to say, and there was no reason to leave it behind when she walked out of the building. The parking lot was damp from afternoon rain. Section D had one overhead light that flickered, which she'd meant to report for months, and now actually would. The drive home took 18 minutes. She made dinner from things she already had, which involved negotiating between limited ingredients in a way that produced something edible and unremarkable. She ate it at her kitchen table. She was tired in the way that she recognized as the right kind of tired. The tired of a day that had asked something real from her and received it, that had used her capacity rather than stored it. She had spent a long time confusing stillness with safety, believing that if she made herself small enough, quiet enough, unremarkable enough, the things that had found her before would pass her by. She had been wrong about that in ways that had nearly gotten a man killed, that had given Morrow 3 years of space to operate, that had cost her 2 years of her own life. The things that were looking for her had known where she was the whole time, and the things worth offering had, the things she actually had, the knowledge and the capability and the willingness to step forward when it mattered, those didn't diminish in the quiet. They waited. They would always be there, waiting. That was the thing about being exactly who you are. You cannot misplace it. You can set it aside. You can try to live around it. You can build a smaller life on top of it and call it peace for as long as that holds. But it does not go anywhere. And when the moment arrives that requires it, the moment that always arrives in one form or another for anyone with something real to give, it is there, available, still fully itself. She washed her dishes. She put the zippered case in the drawer of her bedside table because it was evidence now and it would go to attorneys eventually, but tonight it was hers and she wanted it close. She slept for 8 hours. For the first time in 3 years, she did not dream about the compound. She dreamed about the supply room, about the shelves in order and the counts correct and the morning light coming through the window at the angle she knew, and the work waiting and herself moving toward it without hesitation, without concealment, without the weight of being someone she had decided was easier to be. Just herself. Just Lena. Walking in.